Lena. It's such a privilege to be here, and I've, I sort of enjoyed watching the Khaki introduction that you did, and you do some really great work. Next time I'm in India, I'd love to do one of your tours. So what I'm going to do is
Yes, thank you.
I'm going to share my slide, and I hope you can all see it. Okay, fabulous, wonderful. So thank you very much for having me. So today I'm going to be talking about a history of England and India that has been neglected for quite some time. For various reasons, which we can talk about. And so I'm a specialist in the global Renaissance, so I specialize in the sort of 16th to 15th to 17th century history is my specialism, and particularly I look at English interactions with the wider world, but specifically Asia. So, for example, for my PhD, my research focused on English travel, the first English travelers and traders to India, which was then governed by the Mughals, and their interactions with Mughal queens and how those queens were then represented in English theatre back in England. So this is something that I'm very deeply invested in because the Renaissance was a period in which um, Western Europe and England in particular was reaching out to the wider world on an unprecedented scale. Pretty much the whole of the 15th century was spent by Europe trying to reach India. So whether that's around Africa or across the Atlantic and ending up in the Americas instead, this century was very much focused on reaching India. So my book, Travelers in the Golden Realm, How Mughal India Connected England to the World, basically gives a look at that history, which is pre Britain's empire. So I just wanted to start on this note, particularly for those of us who are South Asian, and India is, of course, those of you in India, you'll understand this, that we have colonial history. We know the experiences of colonization, and we know the experience of manufactured famine. So, for example, in Bengal, we know what it is to have a manufactured famine, a man-made famine that's sort of imposed by a colonial authority. So my book was actually completed when the genocide in Gaza began. So it's dedicated to Gaza, and I'm particularly drawing attention to this now because famine has been announced, and it's been particularly reminding me as a historian of the Bengal famine. And my own family is of Bengali heritage. So it's been particularly evoking to me that historical moment and how we don't seem to have learned from it. We have yet another manufactured famine that was declared by UN yesterday, taking place in Gaza in very similar colonial circumstances. So my book is dedicated to Gaza, and I'm taking this moment to sort of acknowledge that. So, Britain and South Asia. Is it a story of Britain's empire only? Now, we all know the history of Britain and South Asia. Usually we know it in terms of Britain's colonial empire in South Asia. So we know that the Battle of Plassey, 1757, or Polashi, as they say in Bengal, it took place in 1757. And from 1757 until 1947, around, well, exactly 190 years, you had Britain's empire in South Asia. The first century or so was company rule. The second century was British Raj, so ruled directly by the English crown. So much of our popular understanding is centered here in terms of the history of England and South Asia. Now, so much of our understanding of England's historical relationship is kind of centered in this moment, and that kind of tells a very particular story as well. It tells a particular story of British supremacy, British power, and South Asian weakness, South Asian subjugation to a superior British entity. And that's the story that we're often told in South Asia. It's also the story that we're often told in England. So, the two sort of main actors of this history tends to focus on this historical moment in particular. And that's from, historians to cultural productions, films, movies, that sort of thing. All seem to center usually upon this historical moment when we're thinking about the history of India and England. So the question that my book sort of set out to ask, and the question I want you to think about today in this presentation, is: does the history start and end with Britain's empire? Is it focused on that because that's where the history is? Does it start with, did Britain show up to India one day, colonize it, and then thus the relationship was founded. So again, that's the other question I want you to think about, is that did Britain simply arrive and immediately colonize India? Is that what happened? So is it the case that, the East India Company with colonial intent arrived at the shores of Gujarat and Surat, and arrived with the intention that this is a land we are going to colonize, and we can colonize it because we're strong enough to do that. So they just arrived and they colonized, and therefore you had 190 years of the British Raj. Is that how the history began and how the history took place? So my basic story is no, that's not how the history took place. That's not how it worked. And the history is in fact a lot longer than we give it credit for. So that's pretty much what I write about, and what my research is on in this moment in relation to Anglo-Indian history, is that Britain's relationship with South Asia before empire was a very long history. So if we're talking about the imperial period, it was 190 years. The pre-imperial period was of a similar length of time. It started the first English, this isn't the very first Englishman to reach India, but the first Englishman to reach India by sea was in 1579, someone called Thomas Stevens. So that was sort of the first point of contact in terms of direct contact with India, in terms of a direct voyage to India. And so from 1579, if you take that as a start point, until 1757, the Battle of Plassey, is 178 years. It's not very different to the colonial period of 190 years, only shy of 12 years. So the prehistory to empire is a similar amount of time to the British imperial period. And it's also no less significant. It's not a case that the British imperial period is more significant, therefore we talk about it more, we have more writings and cultural productions on it. The pre-imperial period is no less significant. It's the key context to what came afterwards, but also it's not just the key context to what came afterwards, but it's also a history in its own right, and a history that showed that what came afterwards could very much have not happened. So could very much have gone a very different way. So Travellers in the Golden Realm covers this history for the first time, and it is the route to British South Asian heritage that continues to this day. And particularly, Khaki, thank you for inviting me, that you guys focus on heritage. And as a historian, that's something that's very close to my heart in terms of preserving heritage. Our heritage in terms of Anglo-Indian history is a lot longer than we account for. And the history that I present is kind of at the root of that heritage, the foundational moment. Now, there's a number of things that are different about this early period. As I say, the colonial period was very much British authority, British imperial supremacy over a subjugated South Asia, so to speak. And of course, it didn't start. The Battle of Plassey was just one battle, and then slowly they expanded across South Asia. It's not like in one go they took all of South Asia. But when the English first came to India, there was a completely inverted balance of power. The Renaissance world was a world in which Europe was not the global superpowers. It was not the center of power in the world. In that period, the global superpowers were in Asia and Africa, and India was one of the global superpowers. So Mughal India, it was one of the largest empires in the world, one of the most wealthy empires in the world, one of the empires with the largest military in the world, most military technological advancement. Certainly, it was economically hugely advanced. It was a self-financing empire. So this was the Mughal. If I give you an example, the Mughal economy was agrarian, so it taxed based on land. And of course, the Mughal Empire kind of spanned South Asia, so it was a huge region. So land taxation gave huge amounts of revenue. They were entirely self-financing, so they didn't even need international trade or anything like that. By comparison, a lot of Europe was living in debt. They were living off moneylenders because they did not, they did not have that level of income at all. So Mughal India's GDP, for example, outstripped the entirety of the European continent, particularly Western Europe. Europe included the Ottoman Empire at that time. The Ottomans were very similar to the Mughals in terms of political, imperial, and economic authority. But if we're thinking about Western Europe, the whole of Western Europe's GDP was below that of Mughal India. So it was a very different dynamic in that period and a completely inverted balance of power. Now, the case of Britain in particular was Britain was particularly isolated and particularly struggling in this moment in the 16th century. There's a very particular reason for that, and that is because England took a particular stance during the Reformation. You had the Reformation, where you had the rise of Protestant Christianity, and Henry VIII, during his reign, decided to break with the Catholic Church in Rome and shift England into Protestantism. Now, of course, he did that for very self-centered reasons. He did that so that he can divorce his wife and marry Anne Boleyn. But this had huge ramifications for his country as a whole, because it basically isolated the country from Europe, which was majority Catholic. The majority of Europe was Catholic in this time. It was only like the Netherlands, which was sort of breaking with Rome and also Protestant in that direction. So you had England and the Netherlands, but the rest of Europe was pretty much by and large Catholic, and this isolated England from its European cousins. That then went further, and after Henry VIII, his daughter Mary I tried to return Catholicism to the country with quite an iron fist. She didn't succeed, and then her brother came onto the throne for a very short period, and thereafter, well, before Mary was her brother for a very short period, then you had Mary, and thereafter you had Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth was her father's daughter. She was the great Protestant queen. So she suppressed Catholicism. She really reinforced Protestantism. And she, like her father, was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. That was in 1570 that Elizabeth I was excommunicated. Now, excommunication means you're thrown out of the Catholic Church. Not a huge deal for Henry VIII and Elizabeth I personally, because they're not Catholic anyway. They're Protestant. They don't care what the Catholic Church thinks. But it has a huge implications in terms of England's foreign policy, because being thrown out of Catholic Church also means being thrown out of Europe. So this, in 1570, when Elizabeth I is excommunicated, that's kind of like England's first Brexit. So England's isolated from the whole of Europe. That means isolated economically, militarily, diplomatically. So now they have to seek partners elsewhere. And so that's what pushed England, because of this isolation. And England is an island, and it's a very small island at that. So it needs international partners in order to survive and in order to be economically viable. So in the face of that, then England decides to push its more global agenda and start seeking partners abroad. And that's something that Elizabeth I particularly pioneered. And so that's what led England to seek out one of the most powerful and wealthy empires in the world as a partner, Mughal India. And England particularly was trying to sort trade with Mughal India. England was about a century behind its European cousins. So Portugal reached India in the 1400s, 1498. England, under Elizabeth I, set up the East India Company in 1600. And the point of this setting up this company is solely trade, that we need to trade with the wider world, but particularly with the wealthiest regions of the world, such as Mughal India, in order to survive isolated from Europe. Now, so that was the circumstances of England, that England was in this particularly struggling position vis-a-vis Europe, but also within itself in terms of its political fractions, in terms of its religious fractions, and its economic instability. By contrast, Mughal India was in its golden age. So this was the reign of Jahangir, when the East India Company was founded, and Elizabeth sort of gave the East India Company its charter. They were in their golden age. Akbar had died a few years ago. Jahangir took up around 1603. So it was a very, very different political dynamic. If we're thinking about England and India during the British colonial period, you had British political authority over an India that is slowly being colonized. This pre-colonial period was entirely the opposite. It was English petitioners arriving in India with nothing but the desire to beg trade. And that's what they did. You had traders come to India and basically seek meetings with the emperor and seek trade agreements. And the emperor really did not kind of agree to it because Mughal India was entirely self-sufficient. It was self-financing by its agrarian economy. It didn't need international trade. It certainly didn't need trade with England because it didn't like any of England's exports. England's primary export at this time was wool. But also Mughal India, the trade that it did have was with its regional partners, and its regional partners were very wealthy and very productive, and they had, they had rich commerce there. So, such as with Central Asia, with Afghanistan, with Persia, with China, with Indonesia. So its regional trade was flourishing. It really did not need European trade. So in that sense, you had a very, very inverted balance of power. And the terms of encounter in this period, therefore, was trade, first and foremost. It was also diplomacy. So the English sent a succession of ambassadors. The Mughals never sent an ambassador to England, but England sent a succession of ambassadors to the Mughal Empire. So there was diplomacy. There was piracy in later years, particularly Anglo-European pirates who attacked Mughal ships, and the Mughals were very, very unhappy about that. There was also some military conflict. There was one military conflict that was initiated by the East India Company, and the East India Company were battered very badly by it because they attempted to take that on with Alamgir, the Emperor Alamgir, and that emperor was the most militarized of the Mughal emperors. So the East India Company, it was very much shooting themselves in the foot to try to take on the most militarized emperor in his own territory as well. So if you look at the cover art that I've got on the screen now, this is the artwork that is on the cover of the book, and it really gives the dynamic that I'm talking about in terms of what Anglo-Indian encounter was like in this early period. So this is a scene from the court of Shah Jahan. You can see Shah Jahan in his charoka at the center and up. He is facing his sons, Darashikoh and Aurangzeb. And then you can see that below them, you've got people kind of in sort of rows. And that's according to status. That's how the court was arranged. So the people who are the nearest to the emperor on the inside of that gold fence that you can see are the nobility and the aristocracy. And the people on the outside of the fence are commoners or people who are less important, essentially. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the Europeans. That was the dynamic of the Anglo-Mughal encounter, Anglo-Indian encounter in this moment, that Europeans were outsiders. And you can see that they're carrying things in their hand. They're carrying gifts, which are basically there to try to entice the emperor into agreeing to a trade treaty with them. So that was the very, very different dynamic that you had going on in this early period. So the subtitle of the book is How Mughal India Connected England to the World. So England's, and the argument that I make is that England's global birth very much took place via this interaction with Mughal India. Now, why is that the case? As I said, that the English, when they arrived, they brought their primary export, which was wool, popular in Northern Europe, where it's cold, not so popular in India, where it's hot. Of course, parts of India is cold if you go up north, but up there they've got shawls which are made from cashmere, of course, from Kashmir. So and that is far superior to the wools that you can get from Wales, right? Kashmir is very soft, very luxurious. Welsh wool is quite scratchy. So the stuff that the English brought was very, very not popular in Mughal India. So they had to figure out how are we going to trade. For the most part, they traded in silver. So they'd bring in silver specie, they'd mint it in the Mughal mints, and then they'd use that in the Mughal markets because that's the only thing. They had to buy things cash. They couldn't sort of entice India with English exports. But of course, this was a huge loss. So they also had to see how can we diversify our trade in a way that will entice the Indian market. So they studied Indian markets and they saw what is it that is desired in these markets that we can bring in order to enable this trade. And they noticed that India's markets liked spice from Indonesia. It liked ivory from East and West Africa. It liked silk and horses from Persia. It liked porcelain from China. So the English travelers then went off to all these parts of the world in order to get these commodities that the Indian market liked. And so by that, England sort of rebounded off Mughal India to all these other regions of the world in order to advance the Indian trade. And by that, England developed its global identity and became more of an internationalist entity in order to enable and serve its Indian enterprise. So while the main stories about England and India, other regions that become relevant is Persia, where particularly Persian horses were very popular, and the Mughal emperors liked Persian horses as well. Indonesia, which was the global capital of spice, particularly like whole spices, garam masala, so cloves and cinnamons and cardamoms, those sort of things. Then East and West Africa, which was particularly particular sources for ivory. Ivory was very popular in Mughal India, particularly Indian women liked it to turn into jewelry. So Indian women were sort of driving the English trade in India as well. East and West Africa was very fond of Indian cottons. So the English would take Indian cotton cloth over there and trade it for the ivory, and then bring the ivory back to India. The Middle East as well. So also Middle Eastern commodities were quite popular in Mughal India, and also the Americas. The Americas is also a very important part of the story because, as I mentioned, the English traded in silver. Where did that silver come from? The silver was coming from the mines of South America, such as Bolivia and Peru and Mexico. So the story of England and India in this pre-colonial moment is also a very global story, a story that brings in many regions of the world in order to enable England's trade there. So just to look at some of the first arrivals in this period to India. So I mentioned that the very first Englishman to arrive in India by sea was someone called Thomas Stevens, who arrived in 1579. This was during the reign of Akbar. And he was a religious refugee. So the first Englishman to reach India wasn't a trader. We've been talking about trade, but was not a trader. He was, in fact, a Catholic refugee. So this is someone who fled England. He was a Catholic. He was a Catholic and priest, and this was during the reign of Elizabeth I when Catholicism is being suppressed. So he fled England. He went off to Portugal, and then he took a Portuguese vessel and traveled on to India. And in India, once he arrived, he lived there for the rest of his life, some 4 decades. He went on to learn Konkani and Marathi. He wrote a very famous poem called the Krista Purana in Konkani and Marathi, which is basically the story of Christ. And he went on to proselytize in Goa, and he converted many people to Catholicism, as the Portuguese did. But he was the first person to arrive in India, and he was a Catholic refugee from England. So it's again a very interesting story in terms of global power and the direction in which refugees flow. In this world today, many refugees are traveling towards Europe in search of a better life. Back then, they were traveling to regions such as India in search of a better life from Europe. And then, of course, there were the merchants, the key players in this early period. The East India Company, as I said, the East India Company was founded in 1600, but it wasn't until 1608 until the first East India Company vessel docked in India at Surat. And there's a number of reasons for that. The East India Company, in fact, was not established to voyage straight to India. Their first sort of target region was Indonesia. And Indonesia, again, because it was the global capital of spices, and that was the main thing that was driving Europeans to this region. But much like India, when they got to Indonesia, they found no one in Indonesia wants English wool. So they realized that, okay, we have to figure out how to trade in this region for the spice, because no one wants our commodities. And they noticed that traders, such as indigenous traders from the Indian Ocean region, particularly Gujarati traders, were coming to Indonesia with Indian cottons, and that had a roaring trade in Indonesia. So then the East India Company decided we need to go to India to get the cottons in order to trade in spices. And so they sort of rebounded off of Indonesia into India, and then they decided, actually, let's just stay here. The markets here are fabulous too. So in that respect, again, Britain's empire in India was far from intentional and arguably even accidental, which is what I argue, because the English didn't even arrive in the Indian Ocean directed to India. They kind of rebounded into India out of commercial need from Indonesia. So the first East India Company voyage to reach India was in 1608. It was captained by someone called William Hawkins. He's a fabulous character I go into in the book. He's someone who went on to becoming very Indianized. He came to be known as the English Khan and he married an Indian lady called Mariam Khan from the court of Jahangir. She was a ward, an adopted, a foster child of the emperor, that the emperor himself sort of arranged the marriage for William Hawkins. She was a Christian Armenian by background. And then she went on to be the first English lady to then migrate to England, and she lived in London for several years. I also covered diplomats. So the first English ambassador to reach India is Sir Thomas Roe. You can see his picture on the right there. And so he arrived in India in 1615. Through the century, about three English ambassadors were sent to India through the 17th century. Mughal India never sent a single ambassador to England. Again, the desire was very much in this direction, that we need to form an alliance with this powerful region of India. India had no desire or need to connect with England on the same terms. So the first ambassador to arrive was Sir Thomas Roe. He arrived in 1615. He stayed for 4 years, trying to negotiate a trade treaty for England. He didn't succeed. He spent a lot of the time negotiating not with Jahangir, but with Nur Jahan, the Queen. And so his memoirs are very much replete with his experience of engaging with the Queen and trying to entice her into agreeing to a trade treaty with England. And then I also cover interesting characters such as Thomas Coriat, who was a tourist. So Thomas Coriat is the person you can see on the left of the screen. He is the first English tourist to arrive in India. So in this time, travel is very difficult. So reaching India, for example, if you travel by sea, you might set off around February, March, and by the time you reach, it's like September, October. So it takes very many months, and many things could take your life along the way. You could die of scurvy or some other shipborne disease. Dysentery was another one that killed lots of people. You could die of the storms. You could die of piracy. All kinds of things could kill you on that really difficult several months long journeys. So to go to far regions, you had to be a particular kind of a particular kind of person. You'd have a strong constitution. You'd be crazy enough to travel that far and risk your life. And often the thing that would entice you was the potential of getting very rich, right? So that's why so many traders went to India, because they felt that, we go to this rich country, we can get very rich ourselves. And many of them did. Thomas Coriat was the very weird example of someone who decided to go as a tourist. He wanted to go on a walking holiday through India. He wanted to ride an elephant. And so he went to India in 1613. He spent several years there. He spent some time with Sir Thomas Roe as well. They knew each other from back in England. So he went and sort of couch surfed in Thomas Roe's house and stayed with him for months on end, basically outstaying his welcome, but not really caring about it. He's a really, really fascinating character, and he's the first English tourist in India. So I write about him as well. And then, of course, there's the story of the Mughals, because often history is told very much from the victor's perspective, which is part of the reason why we tend to know more about the colonial period rather than the pre-colonial period, because the colonial period has a very clear victor. It's the English colonizers are the victors of that period. The pre-colonial period, the English are very much not the victors. So in that respect, we hear less of that story. But also we tend to often have a rather Eurocentric view of the history, trying to have a very European view of the history. So I try to counter that. I try to look at the various voices that take place, that are active in this particular history. So I look at the Mughals as well. So the emperors that I cover during the Mughal Golden Age is Babur, the founder, to Alamgir. I also look at the queens. So particularly Nur Jahan Begum and Mariam Al-Zamani. Mariam Al-Zamani is famously known as the Rajput wife of Akbar. And so you've got the Bollywood film Jodha Akbar, which is quite popular. It's a lovely film. But I feel that, we really don't do Mariam Al-Zamani justice, because she is far more than just the Rajput wife. She was the greatest merchant of Mughal India in her time. She owned the largest ships that voyaged across the Indian Ocean. They were recognizable from miles away because they were the largest in the Indian Ocean. There were pilgrim ships. They'd take people to Mecca for pilgrimage, and they were also merchant ships. So they'd stop over at Yemen and various regions, and trade also in Mecca as well. And they were really, really lucrative vessels. So Mariam Al-Zamani, she was the greatest trader of Mughal India in her age. And Nur Jahan Begum, she was the wife of Jahangir, and she was the co-sovereign with Jahangir. She was an equal queen, an equal monarch. She minted coins in her name, which only the emperor did, but she did it as well. And she's the only one to have done that. And also, she was one of the great traders of Mughal India. And this is something that's quite significant, which I like to draw attention to, is the fact that the queens were the greatest traders of the Mughal Empire, which is why inevitably they had a lot of interactions with the English and the Europeans, because the English and Europeans came for trade. And so often they thought that they'd have to negotiate with the kings. They'd find out actually we have to negotiate with the queens, which is why Thomas Roe spent 4 years negotiating with Nur Jahan. So you can see a picture of Nur Jahan over there. It may be a familiar picture where she's filling a musket. She's very famous for being a great, being great at hunting and being a great shot. She would ride on an elephant and shoot a tiger point blank, even on from the top of an elephant. So she was really incredible in that respect. I also look at some of the Indian and Persian wives of the English East India Company men. So, for example, Mariam Khan, who I mentioned, who married William Hawkins, the first East India Company captain to arrive in England, but also someone called Teresa Sampsonia, who married an English East India Company merchant called Robert Shirley. You can see Teresa Sampsonia on the far right. She was an incredible woman as well. She was a great marksman, a swordsman, but also she was a polyglot. She spoke very many languages, and she traveled a lot with her husband between Europe and Asia. So she traveled to Persia. She also was a ward of the Persian emperor, just like Mariam Khan was a ward of the Mughal emperor. She traveled between Asia and Europe a lot with her husband. She was known as the ambassadress. So her husband was the ambassador, and she was seen as an equal ambassador as well. Her husband died, and she outlived him by some 40 years, and she made a great name for herself in Europe. And so the portrait that you can see on the far right of Teresa Sampsonia, that was painted by someone called Anthony van Dyck, and he was one of the leading court painters of Charles I. He was the leading court painter of Charles I. So Teresa Sampsonia attained a status. This portrait was taken in Rome, where she was being painted by the leading painters of the age, and she was being hosted by the Pope in Rome. So these are some of the figures who are quite significant in this early historical moment between England and India. There's also some really great major events that take place in this period, which I also cover. So, as I mentioned, that there was a problem of piracy, which the Mughals were very unhappy with. Europeans were targeting ships in the Indian Ocean, including Mughal ships. So two of the major sort of incidents of piracy that I cover, one is the piracy of the Rahimi. The Rahimi was the ship that belonged to Mariam Al-Zamani, the wife of Akbar, and that was targeted by the Portuguese in 1613. Now, this was during the reign of Jahangir, when Mariam Al-Zamani is the Queen Mother, and the Queen Mother held a status in Mughal India that was unmatched. Everyone bows down to the emperor bows down to his mother. That's the one person that the emperor bows down to. So she's inviolable. You cannot mess with the Queen Mother. And the Portuguese targeted her ship. Now, the reason they targeted it was because the English were coming and seeking trade agreements with the Mughals, and the Portuguese saw the English as competition, and they did not want the Mughals to trade with the English. So they thought, okay, the way to get the Mughals' attention is to target his mother's ship. Now, that backfired on them spectacularly, because Jahangir was absolutely outraged, and he went and attacked the Portuguese settlements. He used to pay salaries for Portuguese priests. He took that all back, and the Portuguese really got hit quite badly because of their targeting of Mariam Al-Zamani's ship, the Rahimi. In 1695, there's another major incident of piracy that takes place, which is on a vessel called the Ganji Sawai, and that was a vessel belonging to Alamgir. And this was targeted by an English pirate called Henry Every, and it wasn't just a case of targeting the ship, but they went on a rapacious orgy in the ship as well. They attacked everyone on the ship, and it included relatives of the emperor. So that was another really shocking incident that rocked India, that enraged the emperor, and the English were also almost thrown out of India wholesale because of this one attack. And for the Mughals, it doesn't matter who does the piracy. If they're carrying an English flag, that means the East India Company will be held accountable. because for the Mughals, all Englishmen are the same. So even if the pirate is a completely lone rider pilot who has nothing to do with the East India Company, the Mughal will hold the East India Company accountable. So for the East India Company, it was a really, really very much a priority for them to try to control the piracy that's taking place and control the English pirates and bring them to court and imprison them or execute them, because they were putting the trade in Mughal India in jeopardy. And so the Ganges Sawai was attacked by Henry Every, who's a completely lone ranger sort of pirate, nothing to do with the East India Company. The East India Company had to pay the compensation, and they were almost thrown out, and they had to negotiate and grovel to the emperor until the emperor sort of relented and allowed them to remain. So in that respect, what we see in this early period is the East India Company, this entire time, 178 years, is struggling. They are fighting to survive in India. They almost go bankrupt several times. They almost get thrown out of the empire several times. It's a very, very, again, a very, very different story to the colonial period that we're told that comes much later. I also cover other events such as the Amboina massacre. This is a conflict between the English and Dutch, which takes place particularly in Indonesia. So one of the things, like the Portuguese, the Europeans were hugely competitive in India. They all wanted the monopoly, and they didn't want to share it with any of their European cousins. So this created a lot of conflict, often armed warfare. And that was quite useful for the Indians, actually, because they felt that, right, the Europeans can just keep each other in check, and then, it makes life easier for us. So the Indians were quite happy to let the Europeans fight with each other. And often these fights would take place on sea. So and because the navy was the Mughals' weakest arm of its military, so when the Europeans kept each other in check at sea, it kind of did the Mughals' job for them. So the Mughals were quite happy for the Europeans to be competitive like that. And then another major event that I cover is Child's War. And Child's War is the only Anglo-Mughal war that takes place in this period. It takes place towards the latter part of the 17th century. And that was sort of led by two East India Company officials, both of whom their surname is Child, even though they're not related, so that's why it's called Child's War. And again, this was very, very damaging for the East India Company. The East India Company's main settlement and sort of main office at that point was in Mumbai. And again, they almost entirely lost that. And the conflict was so bad, and the Mughal siege on Mumbai was so bad that the East India Company officials at one point decided that they're just going to flee. They're going to blow up their fort, and they're just going to flee back to England. So again, it was once again this situation of survival, constant survival. So if you see the image on the right of your screen, it's a bit cut off, but this is an image that the French drew of East India Company officials after Child's War coming and begging Alamgir for forgiveness. So if you can see towards the bottom left of that picture, you can see the East India Company officials with their head bowed, almost touching the ground, and Alamgir sort of sitting there. Again, because the Europeans had such competition for the French, they really enjoyed the fact that the English had such a sound beating and defeat at Child's War. So they drew a picture of it to sort of enjoy it. Another important aspect of history which I cover, which I feel is sort of underexplored and underexamined, like much of this history, is the history of slave trading in the Indian Ocean. Now, we're quite familiar with the Atlantic slave trade that was taking place between the Americas and Africa, in which Europeans were trafficking Africans over to the America and forcing them into really brutal enslavement. But this same thing was taking place in the Indian Ocean as well. The slave trade was, in fact, a global reality that was taking place, led by Europeans. So in this period, and I cover this in my chapter 12, the Indian Ocean was a raging space of European trade in enslaved peoples. And it was multi-directional. So they'd be taking people from East Africa, from Arabia, from Indonesia, from China, from India, and trafficking them all over the region. So there was a great deal of slave trading taking place. An example of that, if you look at the image on the right-hand upper side, this is an artwork from a Portuguese volume called the Codice Hesinatense. It's a volume, it's an illustrated volume created in the 17th century, and that's a scene from the island of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. It's an Iranian island. And in the center, you can see Portuguese settlers. They're sitting, they're eating, and the people around them are enslaved people who have been trafficked from the region. And you can see that the people in the center, they're kind of communal, they're sharing in meals, they're sort of, kind of having this bond between them. The people around them are serving them, and they don't have any association with each other. So they're kind of isolated the way laboring enslaved people are forced to be isolated and forced to not have community. So this is another aspect which I cover, which is quite a brutal and dark period of history. Particularly in India, the Bay of Bengal was a particular site of European piracy and European enslavement. So lots of people from the Bengal region, because Bengal, of course, has lots of waterways. So these waterways were being ravaged and targeted by these European slave traders who would abduct people and then traffic them throughout the region. So the Portuguese and the Dutch were particularly known for this, but the East India Company was also very much involved in it. And so, for example, the Portuguese and the Dutch, they built lots of forts in the region. Wherever they built a settlement, these forts would often be built by enslaved labor who were trafficked through the Indian Ocean. So, so ultimately, the story of Britain and India is very much the story of us. It's a story that's a lot longer and more complicated than we often give account for. And that's something that's quite important in terms of, drawing attention to the history. History, if we only look at a part of the history, we're only getting half of the story, and we're not getting a very accurate or nuanced understanding of the history. So really, the history of Britain and India and its interactions is a lot longer. It's a lot more complicated. And particularly this early period is the root of a long and continuing relationship that continues to this day. And, I think that we really need to know the history from its beginning rather than just halfway through from the Battle of Plassey. Thank you very much. That's my Instagram account, my email, and my website if anyone's interested to be in touch or learn more. I will now stop sharing the screen so that I can pass it back to Karina.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Karina.
Thank you. And that was, a lot of information that I think a lot of us haven't heard before. So, and was really interesting, especially about the queens and the trading and how much trade they did. And there are a couple of questions around that, actually. I'm just going to start with the first one. They said, what was the warfare capability of the English Navy at the time of Shah Jahan?
It wasn't, so it was, there was warfare capabilities, particularly because at the time, the reign of Shah Jahan was kind of parallel also with the English Civil War towards the end of the reign. So the English Civil War was taking place in the sort of 1640s. So, I mean, there was a navy, but the reality is that there wasn't a strong navy in India, and because India was very far. And so getting there was very, very difficult. So the East India Company vessels that would go there, often, vessels would sink, all kinds of difficulties would happen, people would die. And so around India, the English had naval capabilities, which were very much used within Europe, but not so much in India. In India, the priority was trade. There wasn't a great deal of naval capabilities. That's one thing. But the other thing is that the East India Company Charter that the royals granted the East India Company did not allow for military conflict until much later. Okay. So until the latter part of the 17th century, military conflict was not permitted.
Can I ask everyone to be on mute, please? Thank you. Okay, the other question was, were the Dutch in South Africa and the French in North Africa and the Spanish in South America all a part of the global design of the Europeans? Like, was it a coordinated thing?
Oh, no, it wasn't coordinated. So there isn't a global design. I think that's quite important for us to understand, that in this period, there isn't a global design. If anything, all of these people are conflicting with each other. All of these people want control of these regions, and all of these people are fighting with each other. So particularly in this period, when the English are trading in India and the Portuguese are trading in India and the Dutch are trading in India, they're not fighting with the Indians. They're all fighting with each other. They never take the fight to the Indians. The Portuguese do a little bit, but they really keep it limited. The Portuguese got there before the Mughals did. Right. But then when the Mughals arrived, they kind of stayed in Goa and didn't move. They didn't challenge because the Mughals were a huge entity.
Mm.
The Europeans never, because they knew that trying to take on the Mughals was folly.
Mm.
Like, this is a global superpower, and they're just traders who just come in one or two ships. So you can't
Yep.
take the Mughals on. And the one time the English do, they get really battered for it. But they're fighting
Mm.
with each other because they want because the focus is trade, they want the trade monopoly. And any European is a competition for trade back in Europe because they want to have the monopoly of taking these rich commodities back to Europe where they can sell it at huge profits. And if there's lots of
Yep.
European traders doing that, then the cost is pulled down, right? So there is absolutely no coordination in this period. A lot often it would be a case that, for example, the Spanish controlled the silver mines in Portugal. They would be taking these ships across the Pacific and across the Atlantic back to Spain, and then via Spain onto Asia, where they trade in India and China, and then across the Pacific onto Manila, where they trade again in China and India and the region. And while they're voyaging, other Europeans would target those ships, attack them, steal the silver, and then use that for their own trade. So it's very much, they're all fighting each other. There isn't a coordination. If anything, they want each other to die so that they can do it on their own.
Okay. So another question, a question about the queens, and as to were there other queens also who had a lot of power besides the two you mentioned, and also within the Parda system of the royal family, how did they actually engage in this trade, and how, which is mostly male dominated?
The trade wasn't male dominated. The trade was
Okay.
very much female dominated. There's a number of layers to address here. One is that the queens, like I mentioned too, but there were very many. Every single generation had very
Yeah.
powerful women, and this started
Yeah.
from Babur. So
Yeah.
Babur's chief political advisor was his nani, was his
Yeah.
maternal grandmother. Chief
Yep.
political advisor. And throughout his memoirs, he talks about his maternal grandmother. But also after his grandmother was his elder sister,
Yes.
Khanzada Begum.
Yes.
Again, and so there was an actual title within the Mughal Empire of Lady Queen.
Mm.
And that began with Khanzada, and it went on, and very different princesses, not just queens, were given this title. So Shah Jahan, after his wife Mumtaz passes away, he names his daughter the Lady Queen of the Empire. So there is a tradition of female queenly and princess authority that starts from the founder of Mughal India and continues throughout his reign. And again, each time an emperor dies and the sons are sort of vying for the throne, the princesses would align with their chosen emperor, and often it's the most powerful princess whose brother would be the one to then reign.
Mm.
So that you had this very established authority. Commercial authority, economic authority, again, as I mentioned, it's often the queens and the princesses who are the greatest traders. Now, the Mughal Empire was the Mughal political authority, and the emperors they didn't sort of make trade a state factor. It was kind of left to individual traders. So, for example, in Gujarat, you had Gujarati traders who would lead. In Surat, you had a trader called Baharji Bohra, who was the greatest trader in the region, and he would often give the East India Company large loans because they often were in debt.
Yeah.
So it wasn't something that was state controlled because the state didn't need it. The state was happy with its taxation, but the queens were involved very much in trade. It was one of their side hustles that they did. At the one end, they were very wealthy; they had land and property and all that, but also they were quite invested in trade. The princesses as well.
Mm.
Um, so and they'd off and the system they had of the zanana, for example, the haram, it wasn't a system which was designed to contain the women. It was designed to exclude outsiders.
Mm.
So the queens could come and go as they pleased. They could do what they wanted, but people couldn't come in because that was the exclusive territory. The
Okay.
zinana was the royal household.
Yeah.
Only the king and the princes are allowed there. Only the women, the royal women of the household, are allowed there. Outsiders who are not important and not relevant do not have access to this place. It is the most exclusive space in the entire empire. So in that sense, it's not about seclusion, it's about exclusion. It's
Mm.
about the power. This is the most powerful space within the Mughal Empire and the most exclusive. So,
Right.
for example, this was the emperor's household. The emperor would go there to sleep. So then the queens and the princesses could influence imperial policy
Mm.
without any of the advisors interfering
Mm.
because they can't get in there, right? So it's a very, very powerful space. And the queens could come and go as they please, which they did. But because they're queens, they're not going to go to the market and buy things. They're too important to do that. They sent their agents.
Hmm.
So it'd be the agents who are negotiating the price, and the queen would be keeping tabs. So
Right.
one example is that Mariam Zamani's agent was buying indigo for her trade,
Hmm.
and an East India Company agent didn't know who he was competing with, went and outbid the queen's agent and made off with the indigo. The agent reported it to the queen. The queen went and told Jahangir. Jahangir yelled at William Hawkins in front of everyone at court, "How dare you outbid my mother?" Right? So after that, and this is replete in the English records, that they are very careful around the queen's trade because that will put their own trade in a lot of peril. They'll get in trouble with the state. So they would tiptoe around the queen's trade. If anything, if they saw the queen's ship in the Indian Ocean, they'd protect it.
Hmm.
Because if anything happens to it, like if an English pirate attacks this ship, the East India Company is going to be in trouble. So they
Yeah.
would protect the ship and
Yeah.
bring it to port just
Okay.
to stay in the good books. So it's
Okay.
a very different dynamic to the kind of story that we're often told.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Two things which are slightly related. What did the East India Company think of Mughal cannons, and was there any trade of gunpowder between the EIC and the Mughals?
There was. So the East India Company used to bring saltpeter, which was used for gunpowder.
Mhm.
And saltpeter was quite useful because it would be used as ballast in the ship. So it would help to weigh down the ships as well as
Mhm.
part of the trade, as part of the voyaging. So they would trade in saltpeter in Mughal India, but Mughal India had its own supplies of saltpeter as well. So it's not like they made a huge dent on the Mughal military in that regard. Um, I don't know too much in terms of East India Company thoughts on Mughal weaponry, but the East India Company certainly had their own cannons as well, which they had on their ships to protect themselves against piracy. But also, for example, when Surat was during the reign of Alamgir, so Shivaji was in battle with Alamgir quite a bit, and Shivaji targeted Surat quite a bit. Surat was the main port city on the western coast of Mughal India.
Yep.
So he attacked Surat several times. And the East India Company, what they do is they bring in their guns from their ships to protect their particular officers from Shivaji's troops. So I mean, the East India Company certainly used their own guns. I don't know too much about whether they had much influence on Mughal weaponry, but Mughal weaponry was very, very advanced. That's part of the reason why Babur
Yes.
succeeded against the Lodi
Yes.
Sultanate. Lodi was cavalry, Babur had guns, he had cannons.
Yeah. Yeah.
But another interesting thing is that the English and European people were often mercenaries who would serve in the Mughal army as well. So there were lots of Englishmen who would
Mm.
arrive with the East India Company and then abscond and go join the Mughal army because they'd make more money that way.
Mm.
They'd get paid better. They'd have more benefits and that sort of thing. So even within the Mughal army, there were lots of Europeans who were serving.
Okay. There's another question about the Church of England, and did it have any role in the division of territories? Was that one of its powers, or was that another papal authority?
The Church of England in this period didn't really have any authority in Mughal India. Again, the East India Company came for trade.
Mm.
The only sort of religious role that was played is that the East India Company often would bring its own chaplains to serve its own people. So there wasn't any proselytizing. There wasn't, like you see in the colonial period where the Church of England has a major role within the colonial project and missionary projects and
Yes.
all those sort of things.
Yes.
And you've got British era churches all over South Asia, including in Bangladesh. In this period, very much not. The chaplains who came were solely there to keep the Englishmen on the faith and to guide the Englishmen. So, for example, Thomas Roe, who was the first ambassador, he was a very devout Christian. So his chaplain at one point, he has a chaplain and the chaplain dies, and he's really in grief about that, and he writes about that in his memoirs. And then his chaplain is soon replaced by another who comes from England called Edward Terry. Edward Terry has a great memoir of his own about the English experience in India in this early moment. But yeah, the chaplains or Church of England people who came were very much directed at serving the East India Company throughout this century, throughout the 17th century. So the first church is then built at Madras towards the end of the 17th century. That's the first English church to be built at Madras. And again, that's just serving the English.
Okay. There's still a little more fascination with the women. So there's obviously that this means the Mughal family women had education. So was there like
Yeah,
an education system?
absolutely. They had masters come and teach them. They were very, very educated. if I give you an example, Akbar was unlettered, right? He couldn't write or read. We historians believe that he may have been dyslexic at the time, but he couldn't write and read. But his aunts and all the queens could. So, for example, Akbar went to his aunt Gulbadan Begum and said, "Please write a history for me of our family that then Abul Fazl can use as a source for my official history." So he actually went to, the queens were literate even if the king wasn't, is what I'm saying. So the queens were very educated, very literate. Aurangzeb used to keep masters for his daughters. They were very, very educated, very accomplished. They were poets. Same with, throughout the Mughal Empire, the queens were very, very educated. They had their own libraries.
Yes.
They had masters who'd come teach them calligraphy, come teach them history, come teach them sciences and maths and everything.
Okay, and other than the Mughals, what about the other rulers of and Europeans? Do you cover that in that book? I think they mean other than the British. Do you, or I'm
So
not.
I focus on the English and the Mughals,
Yeah.
but associated to that, I have a chapter on the Portuguese, I have a chapter on the Dutch, I have a chapter that looks at Shivaji, although he's not mentioned, he's not named, but
Yeah.
I look at the Maratha conflict in relation to Alamgir. So I do look at some of the other rulers in India as well, but the
Oh,
primary focus is England and Mughal India.
okay. Okay, I think that's it with our questions. Oh, there's one more question about the queens. Did they learn English? I think that's the last question.
They had no need to. The lingua franca was Persian and Hindi and Turkish. English was not an important language in this time. So
Absolutely.
the English used to learn
Yes,
Persian and Farsi and these languages.
I would think
So
it
the
would be
queens
that.
didn't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, thank you again very, very much. And
Thank
I
you for
look
having
forward
me.
to reading your book, and I hope we can have you on again for another talk sometime. But thank you
Sure,
for
sure. I'd
being,
be happy to.
yeah, and thank you all for attending as well. And we will see you next Saturday and hopefully on some of our walks tomorrow. Okay, good night. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.